April 12, 1945. The Elbe River, Germany. Dawn light breaks cold across the water, turning the surface silver and still. On the eastern bank, a Wehrmacht sergeant crouches behind the shattered remnants of a stone bridge, his eyes scanning westward through the morning mist. The bridge, once a proud span of German engineering, now lies in pieces beneath the current, dynamited 3 days prior on orders from high command. Every crossing for 30 kilometers has been destroyed, every ford mined, every ferry sunk. The river, they were told, would be their fortress. The river would hold. But then he hears it, a deep, mechanical rumble that seems to rise not from the opposite shore, but from within the water itself. The sergeant raises his field glasses, squinting through the fog. What emerges from the mist defies every tactical doctrine he has learned, every assumption about the limitations of armored warfare. American Sherman tanks, 30 tons of steel and firepower each, are crossing the Elbe River without benefit of bridge, without pontoons, without any visible means of support. They move through water that should drown their engines, advancing in formation as if the river were merely another stretch of French countryside. The sergeant's hands begin to tremble, not from cold, from the sudden, crushing realization that he is watching something his army cannot do, something his commanders said could not be done. This moment, replicated across dozens of German rivers in the spring of 1945, represented more than tactical surprise. It embodied a technological and industrial chasm that had grown unbridgeable, a demonstration of American engineering ingenuity that German defenders found both incomprehensible and terrifying. The story of how American tanks learned to swim is the story of how democracy's chaotic innovation triumphed over fascism's rigid efficiency. The German army that went to war in 1939 was in many respects the most professionally trained military force in Europe. Its doctrine emphasized speed, concentration of force, and the exploitation of terrain. Rivers were considered natural defensive barriers, second only to mountains in their ability to halt armored advances. German military engineering had developed sophisticated bridging techniques, portable spans, assault boats, rapid deployment pontoons. But these all required time, specialized equipment, and vulnerable construction phases during which engineers worked exposed to enemy fire. The fundamental assumption remained unchanged from the days of Caesar. To cross a river with heavy equipment, you needed a bridge. American military planners approached the problem differently. In the years following Pearl Harbor, as the United States transformed itself into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, a peculiar kind of creative chaos characterized weapons development. Unlike the German system, where military requirements flowed through rigid hierarchical channels, American innovation often emerged from unexpected places: civilian engineers, eccentric inventors, even Hollywood special effects designers. One such figure was Donald Roebling, heir to a construction fortune, who had spent the 1930s developing an amphibious rescue vehicle for use in the Florida Everglades. His Alligator, a tracked vehicle capable of traversing both land and water, caught the attention of the Marine Corps in 1940. What if, military planners wondered, the concept could be scaled up? What if a tank could be taught to swim? The result was the DD tank, DD standing for duplex drive, a standard Sherman fitted with a collapsible canvas screen and twin propellers. Raised, the screen formed a flotation barrier that gave the 30-ton vehicle enough buoyancy to float. The propellers, powered by the tank's engine, pushed it through water at nearly 4 miles per hour. Lowered, the screen collapsed, and the Sherman became again a conventional fighting vehicle. The system was ingenious, improbable, and, to European military minds, borderline absurd. British officers who first observed trials in 1943 nicknamed them Donald Duck tanks, the initials a convenient coincidence. The name stuck, though the vehicles themselves would prove anything but comical. German intelligence received reports of amphibious Sherman tanks as early as the autumn of 1943, when DD tanks participated in training exercises visible from occupied French shores. The reports were filed, analysed, and largely dismissed. The concept seemed too fantastical, too mechanically unreliable. German engineers calculated the weight-to-buoyancy ratios and concluded that any such system would be fatally vulnerable to even minor damage, would require perfectly calm water conditions, would sacrifice armor protection for dubious mobility. The risk-benefit analysis, conducted through the lens of German military conservatism, suggested the Americans were wasting resources on an elaborate gimmick. Then came June 6, 1944, Normandy. In the grey dawn off Sword and Juno beaches, German defenders watched in disbelief as tanks emerged from the sea itself, rising out of the surf 2,000 yards from shore, still beyond the reach of anti-tank guns. Some German soldiers, exhausted from the naval bombardment, believed they were hallucinating. Others concluded they were witnessing some kind of American secret weapon, perhaps a hovercraft or submarine tank hybrid. The reality, canvas screens and jury-rigged propellers, was simultaneously more mundane and more devastating. It meant the Americans had solved a problem the German army had never seriously attempted to solve. It meant the industrial and creative gap was wider than intelligence had estimated. Of the 34 DD tanks launched toward Omaha Beach that morning, 27 sank in rough seas, a failure rate that seemed to vindicate German skepticism. But on the British and Canadian sectors, where sea conditions were marginally calmer and launch points closer to shore, the amphibious Shermans delivered crucial fire support in the first, deadly minutes of the landing. More importantly, the Americans learned. They adjusted launch distances, improved waterproofing, refined deployment procedures. By the time the Allied armies reached the Rhine in March 1945, DD tank operations had been perfected into a routine, if remarkable, capability. The German soldiers dug in along the western bank of the Rhine expected the crossing to follow historical precedent. The Allies would mass artillery, establish a bridgehead with infantry and boats, then spend days constructing pontoon bridges under fire, while engineers swept mines and German air attacks harassed the construction. This was how river crossings worked. This was how it had always worked, from the Romans to Napoleon to the Great War. German commanders positioned their strongest defences to contest the bridgeheads and interdict bridge construction. They prepared for a grinding, multi-day battle. What they got instead was a spectacle that defied doctrine. On the night of March 22nd, under cover of darkness and smoke, the first DD tank slipped into the Rhine north of Mainz. German sentries heard the engines, muffled but unmistakable, and strained to see through the smoke and darkness. When the wind shifted, revealing the river's surface, they saw the impossible. The distinctive silhouettes of Sherman tanks moving across 400 yards of open water, their hulls mostly submerged, their canvas screens glowing ghostly white in the moonlight. Some German gunners, paralyzed by confusion, delayed firing crucial seconds. Others shot at what they thought were boats, aiming too high, their rounds passing over the low-profile DD tanks. By the time German artillery found the range, the first Shermans were already grinding up the eastern bank, collapsing their flotation screens and engaging defensive positions with their main guns. A Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured 2 days later, would tell his interrogators, "We were taught that the river is the defender's friend, that water stops tanks. Your army has made the river meaningless. How do we defend against an enemy who ignores geography?" The interrogation transcript preserved in the National Archives captures something more profound than tactical dismay. It reflects a dawning awareness that American material abundance had altered the fundamental equations of warfare. The DD tank was not an isolated phenomenon. It was one expression of a broader American approach that German soldiers encountered again and again in the war's final year. a willingness to engineer solutions to problems that traditional military thinking accepted as unchangeable constraints. American forces crossed the Ruhr, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Elbe with an array of improvised and purpose-built equipment: floating trucks, swimming jeeps, amphibious cargo carriers, bridge-laying tanks that could span a gap in minutes. Each innovation was another reminder of the industrial depth behind the Allied advance. For the German defenders, the psychological impact compounded the tactical surprise. These were soldiers schooled in the Wehrmacht's culture of resourcefulness, men who had learned to repair vehicles with wire and salvaged parts, who made winter camouflage from bedsheets, who prided themselves on doing much with little. Now they faced an enemy who approached obstacles not with ingenuity born of scarcity, but with purpose-built equipment born of abundance. There was no improvisation in a DD tank. It was designed, tested, manufactured by the hundreds, shipped across an ocean, and deployed as standard equipment. The message was inescapable. America possessed resources so vast that it could afford to develop specialized solutions to minor tactical problems. The sound of the DD tank's propellers, a distinctive churning splash, became an object of dread along German river defenses in the war's final months. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, spoke of it in letters and diaries with a particular unease. Russian tanks, they wrote, were brutal and numerous, but comprehensible within the logic of total war, quantity overwhelming quality through sheer mass and will. The swimming Shermans represented something else, an enemy with the luxury to perfect technical solutions, to train crews extensively, to discard or refine equipment that didn't perform to standard. It was warfare waged not from desperation, but from surplus. In the town of Remagen, where American forces famously captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March 7, 1945, German combat engineers had rigged the span with demolition charges meant to drop it into the Rhine at the first sign of American approach. The charges detonated, but incompletely, sabotaged, some claimed, though more likely the result of hasty preparation and deteriorating explosives. The bridge stood long enough for American armor to pour across. German defenders on the eastern bank watched the Shermans come, and many chose surrender over a futile defense. In interrogation, these men repeatedly mentioned the same detail. The Americans, they said, didn't even seem surprised the bridge was still standing. They crossed it with the casual confidence of men who expected success, who assumed obstacles would yield. And if the bridge had fallen, the prisoners believed, correctly, that swimming tanks would have been in the water within hours. This assumption of abundance, this expectation that technology would answer tactical needs, was foreign to the German military culture of 1945. The Wehrmacht of the war's final year was an army of scarcity, hoarding fuel, rationing ammunition, cannibalizing broken vehicles to keep a fraction of their armored force mobile. Panthers and Tigers, superior on paper to the Sherman in armor and firepower, sat immobilized for want of gasoline or spare parts. German soldiers watched American columns pass with hundreds of vehicles, each one expendable, each one backed by a logistics network that treated a destroyed tank as a minor accounting problem rather than a strategic loss. The DD tank's canvas flotation screen, when German engineers finally examined captured examples, astonished them with its simplicity. Rubberized canvas, structural hoops, a release mechanism, nothing that required rare materials or exotic manufacturing. The Germans could have built such a system, but they had never committed the resources to do so because the concept seemed wasteful, a luxury of nations not fighting for survival. This perhaps was the deepest shock, not that the Americans possessed overwhelming resources, but that they were willing to expend those resources on solutions to problems German doctrine taught soldiers to accept. By April 1945, as American and Soviet forces converged on Berlin, the swimming Shermans had become something more than a weapon. They were a symbol immediately recognizable to German soldiers as representing the material and philosophical gap between the Third Reich and the democracy it had thought it could defeat. Officers who had spent years training to defend river lines, who understood the tactical geometry of water barriers and bridge-based counterattacks, found their expertise rendered obsolete by an enemy who simply bypassed the entire paradigm. It was not unlike watching an opponent ignore the rules of chess and move pieces in impossible patterns, and win anyway. The war in Europe ended 33 days after the Elbe crossing. In the vast documentation of surrender, divisional war diaries, commander debriefings, soldier testimonies, a common thread emerges. German military men, attempting to explain defeat, returned again and again to moments when they witnessed something their army could not match or counter. The swimming tanks appear frequently in these accounts, often described with an almost bitter admiration. They made war like a rich man fights, one panzer commander recalled. We made war like beggars. In the end, the beggar always loses. The DD tanks themselves would fade from use rapidly after the war. The Cold War's focus on mechanized combat in Central Europe produced better river-crossing solutions, dedicated bridge-laying vehicles, improved amphibious carriers, even air-portable armor that avoided water obstacles entirely. Most of the swimming Shermans were scrapped or sold off to minor militaries. A handful survived in museums, their canvas screens preserved behind velvet ropes, their improbable history reduced to descriptive plaques. But the lesson they embodied endured. In every subsequent conflict where American forces confronted authoritarian powers, from Korea to the Persian Gulf, the pattern repeated. Adversaries who assumed that certain obstacles were insurmountable, that certain problems had no solution, that certain costs were too high to bear, discovered they were fighting an opponent unburdened by such assumptions. The DD tank was the progenitor of precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, real-time satellite reconnaissance, technologies that seemed fantastical until they became standard, that rendered enemy doctrine obsolete not through superior courage, but through superior creativity, married to abundant resources. The Wehrmacht sergeant on the Elbe's eastern bank, watching those first Shermans emerge from the water on that cold April morning, could not have articulated all of this. But in the moment his hands began to tremble, in the seconds before he gave the order to retreat, he understood something profound. He was watching the future defeat the past. He was seeing what happens when a free society's chaotic innovation confronts a dictatorship's regimented efficiency over the span of years. The river, that ancient, reliable friend of defenders, had become an irrelevance. And if the Americans could teach tanks to swim, what other impossibilities would they make mundane? The water churned white with propeller wash. The Shermans kept coming, and somewhere behind them across an ocean they had also crossed, factories were already building the next generation of improbabilities, dreaming up solutions to problems that didn't yet exist, spending the surplus of democracy on the tools of its survival. The lesson written in the Current that morning was simple and absolute. Abundance, given purpose, is invincible. Freedom, given time, innovates its way past every barrier. Even rivers,